Oh. Hello everyone, my name is Antonella Zottola and I'm doing this short video today because I want to introduce a new approach into looking at mental illness and looking at mental illnesses and offer a more healthy way of going about things. So a lot of mental illnesses seem to be linked to psychosocial trauma. By this I mean oppression, which is at the core of our society, and the isms that come along with it. So just to name a few, we've got ableism, racism, ageism, classism, heterosism, sexism. And the fact that this is just a limited list of them just shows how problematic things are systematically. Then we have wars, homelessness, unemployment, we have exploitive working conditions, sometimes even when we do have employment, the pressure of unrealistic targets, the inhumane hours, the attitude of profit over people, and the fact that we're made to function like robots. We have the dysfunctional family dynamics. A lot of the times society gaslights survivors into forgivingness, or they're made to be the black sheep of the family if they are estranged from toxic family members, especially if these toxic people and toxic family members are parents. And we also have toxic and abusive relationships that can be in the workplaces with the boss, or that can be friendships, but that most commonly are with intimate relationships and romantic relationships. And then here again, we see the problem of survivors of abusive relationships being forced or told about marriage or couple counselling when the issue is an abusive one and not a relationship one. So again, I believe that we are seeing things and doing things in the wrong way, and that maybe we should look at it differently and find different alternatives and really be open-minded. We tend to pathologize natural human responses to these hurts, and that is problematic. It is natural to emotionally bleed from these injuries, and for these to affect us both psychologically and emotionally, because our mind, body and soul are interconnected, not separated. But where the problem comes is that we tend to separate the mind from the body and the body from the mind, and vice versa. So many mental disorders, illnesses, diseases, again, can be social, biological, but we're reducing things just to a biological level and placing the focus here and not on the root problem, which in many cases is a systematical one, which is creating the environment that we are living in, and it's the environment that is affecting our well-being. Gabor Mate, who's an expert on trauma, and he's a former physician, states this himself, and he's recently created an approach called the compassion inquiry approach. And what this does is get to the root of common mental health challenges by focusing on what's happened, not on what's wrong with us, and at looking at other factors. So basically what we are doing is pathologizing individuals, and when we are doing that, we're ignoring trauma. By just treating the symptoms and the biological consequences, we are dealing with the impact of trauma, but not the trauma itself, or what is causing traumatized individuals. And how can we live in a traumatized world and expect not to be affected or respond in ways that we are wired to? And how can any person even want to live in such a destructive society or world? So what I am proposing is that mental illnesses can be seen as a defense mechanism. An example that I want to give and talk about is DID, because DID is one of those very, I believe, ignored and hidden and mental illnesses that is not really spoken about. And if we look at DID, which stands for dissociative identity disorder, we come to see that it is such a creative way for our brains to survive horrors that are so unimaginable and so overwhelming to the human psyche that without this survival strategy, we couldn't live. So again, it's a defense mechanism. It's something that's trying to protect us and something that is keeping us alive rather than a disorder, as mental illnesses can be seen as. If we look at depression, which can be the denial of self and emotions, depression is depressing, is to depress, depress is to push down. So we're pushing down our emotions. Society tells us not to show our emotions, and we see this especially in crying at a young age. And I've worked in schools, so I see how this takes place as well. And many times we'll have a child, and the child is told not to cry. Big boys and girls don't cry. Stop crying. It's okay. So it's being dismissed, and crying in itself as well is a healing process. So when we tell people to stop crying, we're actually hindering that process that needs to happen, that healing process, that release. And also depression is denial of self. We get depressed because we can't be our authentic self. And again, if we look at society, there's conditions of worth. We need to look a certain way. We need to be a certain way. We need to have certain things in order to feel worthy. So sometimes people feel like they can't be themselves, especially if we look at people that, you know, how the attitude is or has been to gays and lesbians, or people that are trying to change their gender because they don't feel comfortable in the body that they are. And especially gender and gender stereotypes are very, can be very damaging. Again, going back to crying, a lot of depressed people tend to be men because gender stereotypes are always telling men to man up, calling them weak if they show emotion, telling them from a young age that boys don't cry, or boys shouldn't cry. And biological anthropologists argue that depression is an adaptive response to adversity, and that it is not, as we come to know it, as a mental disorder. So again, it's backed up by biological anthropologists. And it's also backed up by neuroscience. So Stephen Porges created what is known as the polar vagal theory. The polar vagal theory looks at our nervous system, and that our emotions come from our bodies and happen in our nervous system. So responses for our survival, such as flight, and freeze, all come from the polar vagal theory. And he said that again, it's a biological defense strategy for the purpose of survival. So I'm not saying that it doesn't affect us on a biological level, because as we know, trauma can change our brain structure, and it does, and our brain development, especially in childhood and when we've had childhood adversities. But what I am saying is that what has happened is human suffering, and that our bodies are responding naturally to events. And just like the immune system fights off infections and viruses, society and the systematic oppression that it brings and all the damaging things that it brings is the virus that infects us with all that is wrong and damaging. Peter Levine, who also looks at trauma, states that trauma is the most ignored and misunderstood. And I couldn't agree more on this. And John Brier, who's a traumatologist, stated that if CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic disorder, were ever to be given its due, that the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders would shrink from the size of a huge encyclopedia to just a thin pamphlet. So a lot of these mental diagnoses are diagnosed by certain criteria and by this manual. And a lot of the times as well, there's so many people that are just being dismissed through diagnoses and having their traumas ignored. But on top of that, they're also being misdiagnosed. Or somebody might say, oh, you had a childhood trauma, right? And then they'll be instantly labelled with borderline personality disorder. So we really need to be careful on this. So what I am proposing and what I am saying is this video is that if we want to help and support those suffering, and especially with mental challenges, we need a different approach. We need a holistic approach. We must be allowed to be human and respond as such. And we have to reduce the number of people and to reduce the number of people suffering, we have to change the traumatized and abusive society that is causing this. And that helps us either remain stuck, living in trauma, or like I said, causes it. And there are 3 important things that I personally believe that we should stop doing. So we should stop pathologizing human suffering, we should stop victim blaming, and we should stop toxic positivity. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this really helpful, and I hope that we can be that change together. You can find me on Facebook. I have a page called Rising Phoenix Counseling, and I post every now and then on there. So I've hoped you enjoyed this. Please share it with anyone you think it might help, and just to educate and get the message across. And thank you so much for your time and for listening. Thank you, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.